Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. Barkeep Upkeep is a new series I'm experimenting with where I wish to open the floor up for discussion about certain topics that come up in Commander. I enjoy conversing with everyone who comments on my videos. It's these conversations in the comment sections that inspired this series. I would like to involve more Commander players to these discussions and hopefully have the comment sections of these videos become a sort of open forum where everyone can be involved in these discussions. Hopefully these videos are helpful to those who haven't been playing Commander or Magic in general for long and need a bit more guidance. Likewise, I hope for these videos to spark discussion with enfranchised players as well in order to have interesting conversations on these topics. I would also like to hear your experienced opinions on the topics I wish to cover in this new series. I hope Barkeep Upkeep can serve as an educational tool to help players improve their game as well as improve their gaming experience. For example, I've read in many places about the toxicity in playgroups and LGSs, as well as being unsure about gauging the power levels of their decks. I also want to tackle simple things like explaining complicated rules and interactions, as well as presenting oldies but goodies that many players have no idea exist. In summation, I want this series to be an outlet for myself in order to continue explaining things to players as I do in my other video series, as well as an outlet to share opinions between players at all levels. I want the Magic experience to be unifying and not divisive. It's way easier to have a controversial rhetoric and shove blame on others or throw stones at other players than to see things from their perspective. Therefore, this series will be one where I express opinions as well as how-tos and advice. Hopefully, it achieves its goal as well as being entertaining. Alright, so on with the pilot episode. Apologies for the intro, but I felt it was necessary before starting a new series where the title of its pilot episode is Stop Playing Battlecruiser Magic. Not that I'm going to tell you what to do or how to revise your entire deck building strategy, but whenever I read or hear about players complaining about certain cards or certain things that happen in their games, more often than not, it's because their deck contains little to no responses. These decks are built as if they're playing a multiplayer solitaire match with other players at the same table. And almost all of their problems are solved when they devote more slots in their deck towards answers and responses. When building decks, players need to test them out against other players and thus tweak them as necessary. If something isn't working, it isn't your opponent's fault for finding the chinks in your armor and the weaknesses in your strategy. You should use your defeats as a learning experience and improve your decks. As an opponent, it's my job to find the flaws in a strategy and exploit them as necessary. It's like a chess match. Most openings have weaknesses or ways to work around them, and expert players know these and exploit them in order to win. This is the mentality that should be adopted when testing a deck. What were my weaknesses? Where did my deck fail? Are the responses needed meta calls or things that have to be dealt with on a general level? These are all questions that you should ask yourself when you lose a match. I can understand the salt when a player has a field full of creatures and then an opponent casts a Wrath of God. But honestly, what did you expect to happen? For the opponent to do nothing and just let you keep that field full of creatures? That's just wishful thinking. The purpose of this video is to open eyes towards these situations and have players become better players and brewers overall. I know that the Command Zone has plenty of videos where they go over the do's and don'ts of deck construction and even give a ratio of what to include in your deck with what types of cards, etc. That advice is golden. You need to include responses in your deck as well as ways to accelerate your plays while you're piloting your deck, whether you're accelerating mana and or draws. Personally though, I wouldn't go so far as giving exact numbers in the sense of what percentage of the deck should be devoted to which type of cards, because it all depends on the deck and the strategies they're in. But the reasoning is an excellent starting point. The other end of the spectrum preaches synergy over function. I feel like that's fine if you want flavor points. If your goal is to cater to flavor, then awesome, you do you. No one should judge you. But if you get the feel-bads because you lost a match, then maybe you shouldn't have devoted so much of the deck to synergy. If you don't feel that way because your deck did what you wanted even though you lost, then that's great. Winning doesn't equate to victory. If you achieved a personal victory and had fun, then that's the spirit of Commander. This episode is more for those who blame the Wrath of God player for their loss. I'm sorry to say this, but I do so in the most helpful way possible. If you lost your board state to the Wrath of God, it's not the caster's fault, it's yours. Instead of demanding that player to remove Wrath of God from their deck, you should add pertinent answers to it in yours. If your deck relies heavily on creatures, then you need ways to protect those creatures. Something as simple as Boros Charm does a lot against an opponent's Wrath of God. In fact, that turns that Wrath of God into something amazing for you because the opponent did the work of clearing the board of any blockers. That simple Boros Charm probably just won you the match. It wasn't the Wrath of God that won you the match, it was the Boros Charm. Thinking ahead and keeping defensive cards in hand is an excellent way to secure a victory because the best offense is usually a good defense. The same can be said for cards like Heroic Intervention. What's great about these effects is that they're plentiful in Magic. Depending on your color identity, you could easily have a necessary amount of your deck dedicated to protective effects. And you don't even need that many answers because most of the time you have the luxury of letting the board wipe slide. You need to keep those answers in hand for when you don't have the luxury of losing your board state. However, threat assessment is potentially a topic for a future episode. What's important to understand about board wipes is that most decks are going to run them, and most decks should run them, because this is a multiplayer format. Since the likelihood of facing a board wipe is almost guaranteed, decks should never be without ways of dealing with board wipes. So, returning to the topic at hand, how do you stop playing Battlecruiser Magic? Well, you need to evaluate your deck as you play it in an actual game. Is your deck weak against board wipes? Do you hate Cyclonic Rift? Well, the beauty of these cards is that they're actually pretty easy to play around. Let's take Cyclonic Rift as an example. I am totally and utterly against the banning of Cyclonic Rift. There's no need to ban it. Banning it will do more harm than good because it helps keep a lot of strategies in check. It costs a whopping 7 mana to overload, and even then, it's usually cast when the board is full of permanents and the caster wants to keep an advantage. So it's not something to anticipate unless the board state calls for it. So let's just take a couple of examples on how you can deal with Cyclonic Rift. Fellow blue players can deal with Cyclonic Rift with cards that cost less than a quarter. Off the top of my mind, you have Dispel, Negate, and Dissipate. Red players have Red Elemental Blast, and I know plenty of red players who play that card just to deal with Cyclonic Rift and counter magic as well when playing against blue players, which is the entire reason that card exists in the first place. Oh, and it costs a quarter. White players have Manatith, a card that costs about 5 quarters. No blue player will expect a white player to counter their Cyclonic Rift. They're not going to keep an extra mana open to protect against Manatith. White players also have Eerie Interlude, a card that costs about 7 quarters. This spell delay exiles all of your creatures in response to Cyclonic Rift. Then, at the end of the turn, they return to the battlefield. So now you get to keep your creatures in play, as well as the caster of Cyclonic Rift. That puts quite the damper on their plans. Hell, White even has Nevermore, a card that costs about 3 quarters. If the fear of Cyclonic Rift is so great, just prevent players from being able to cast them all together with Nevermore. Other cheap cards against Cyclonic Rift are Guttural Response and Legion's Initiative. Guttural Response is great for non-blue decks to have an answer to Cyclonic Rift. Legion's Initiative is very similar to Eerie Interlude, but you don't need to keep mana open in order to cast it, or in this case, activate it. However, the most important thing these cards have in common is that they're all incredibly cheap, meaning anyone can play them in their deck. Budget players rejoice because you can deal with Cyclonic Rift with a card that costs 1/20th as much. But what about cards like Tooth and Nail, or commanders like Kalia of the Vast? Okay, well, what about them? Any counterspell can deal with Tooth and Nail, and you don't need Force of Will, Pact of Negation, or Mana Drain to counter it. Just because those are considered the best counterspells doesn't mean that they are the only counterspells. Negate is such a great counterspell. Negate gets rid of so many cards, I'm surprised more people don't run it. For just 2 mana, Negate laughs in the face of an Entwined Tooth and Nail, something that requires 9 mana to try and pull off. That being said, blue players aren't the only ones with answers to these spells, and that's the entire point of this video. Stop playing Battlecruiser Magic. Run responses in your deck. White players have access to Containment Priest. Fortunately, this card has been reprinted enough times that you can acquire it for less than 6 quarters. In response to the Kalia player cheating huge creatures into play, flash in Containment Priest, or just exile it with Swords to Plowshares. For just 1 mana, you can get rid of anything Kalia cheats in. And it's been reprinted so many times that you can procure one for about 4 quarters. Path to Exile is another amazing way to deal with threats. It's 5 times more expensive than Swords to Plowshares, but you can thank Modern for that. Black is quintessentially the go-to color for removal, so if your deck has black in its color identity, there's no reason not to run removal spells in it. And this brings me to my final point. You can't play a game and expect zero interactions. It's just not going to happen. That is unreal. That is not magic. You can't get upset at a player playing stacks effects because those cards exist. You can't get upset at an Armageddon after you've been ramping for days because that is the appropriate response for relentless ramping. You can't get upset when someone wipes the board when it's full of creatures because that is the appropriate action. On the contrary, that is to be expected. If you don't understand that your deck needs ways to deal with these kinds of common occurrences, then you honestly need to reevaluate your self-imposed restrictions. That being said, I'm only saying this for those players who become disenchanted when losing against common multiplayer magic practices like board wipes, powerful creatures, and oppressive effects. As I mentioned earlier, if you are the biggest threat at the table and a player casts a Wrath of God, you can't get upset at them for doing so because that is the correct action. If you're fine losing as long as you did your thing, then keep doing your thing. But if you get aggravated or annoyed at losing yet don't understand why, the reason probably is because you're not running responses in your deck. I can understand the feeling of excitement when brewing an idea and trying to fit in as many cards as possible that synergize with the main strategy or side strategies, etc. Bonus points if you have responses that align with your strategy. However, if the strategy you're brewing with doesn't have any synergistic responses, then you need to add them. That's simple. If you're playing a mono-green stompy deck and you only care about big mana and splashy plays and overrunning your opponents with a huge horde of creatures, then your deck is 100% weak and susceptible to board wipes. It's that simple. You're not going to lose any flavor points if you run Rapid Vigor, Heroic Intervention, Inspiring Call, Eldrazi Monument, etc. What you're doing is ensuring that your main strategy goes through even if someone has a response to it. In this case, the response being a board wipe. You need ways to protect your strategies, and that's fine. Additionally, you need ways to interact with your opponents as well. Following the same example of the mono-green stomping deck, you need ways to prevent your opponents from winning as well. Running something as simple as Scour from Existence or Beast Within solves so many problems. They get rid of any permanent. There's no excuse not to run these. They get rid of anything on the board as long as it doesn't have Shroud, Hexproof, or Protection. If an opponent resolves a Consecrated Sphinx, just target it with Beast Within. Problem solved. If you don't want to lose against Storm or Combo when playing the aforementioned mono-green stompy deck, then run cards like Damping Sphere. And you don't even need to run 20 or more cards like these in your deck. A dozen is enough. I apologize if my rhetoric seems a bit harsh, but interactions are a huge part of what Magic the Gathering is. No one is just going to sit back and allow their opponents to win. So you can't expect to get an engine going and not have an opponent throw a wrench in it. If you leave your queen open and your opponent can capture her with little or no consequence, you can't get upset at your opponent for seizing the opportunity. I've seen damaging philosophies poison new players and get blindly accepted like infallible dogma, but all it ends up doing is aggravating and frustrating new players and making them angry at the opponents who, quote-unquote, don't let them play the game, or quote-unquote, play staples when you just want to be original. You can have a super original deck, but you still need ways to protect your own strategy while also disrupting your opponent's strategy. That's just how the game works. Trust me, if you take the time to analyze where your deck is failing and make the appropriate changes like taking out the more subpar cards and slotting in responses, your deck will run exponentially better. Not only that, but it'll make you a better player as well. And even if you lose, you won't feel like it was an overwhelming loss because you did your thing while also playing reactively and proactively. You can still be a flavorful brewer, and you can still make original decks while slotting in cards that help your strategy be resilient against its weaknesses, as well as slotting in wrenches of your own against opponents. The purpose of this episode is to open players' eyes against the perils of Battlecruiser Magic. It's not to talk down on anyone's deck-building philosophies or originality. I'm just keeping it real. Interactions are an integral part of the game. The error is in expecting, or even worse, demanding, players to not run cards like Wrath of God or Consecrated Sphinx. The error is in not including cards in your own deck to deal with cards like Wrath of God or Consecrated Sphinx or the flavor of the week, nay, the year, Cyclonic Rift. I've even seen Commander Leagues fail because of additional and ridiculous deck-building restrictions set into place that actually suffocate the creative process and did more harm than good. The whole enticement of Commander is the huge card pool. Deck building already has its built-in restrictions due to the singleton nature of the format plus the commander's color identity. This is why the mistake lies in telling players what not to run instead of enlightening players in how to deal with those particular cards. There's also an aspect of the social contract in all of this, but that topic is enough for its own episode. In conclusion, the opponent who casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift is not the devil. Even the devil has weaknesses. If you hate board wipes, brew your deck accordingly. You need to have responses in your deck, both reactive and proactive. It's just the harsh reality of things. Trust me, if you build your decks with this in mind, you'll have more fun playing because you'll have more engaging and interactive games. Watch any game online on the channels dedicated to gameplay videos, and there are plenty of them, from large channels like Spike Feeders, Playing with Power, and MTG Mudsta, to smaller ones like Affinity for Commander and CEDH TV. Which are the best and most entertaining games? The ones with the most interactions happening throughout the match. What are the most satisfying victories? The player who took the win seemingly out of nowhere. Well, to me at least. Why should you stop playing Battlecruiser Magic? Because Magic is not a Battlecruiser game. Magic has a stack. Magic has instant speed, spells, and abilities. Magic is a very complex and reactive game. Immerse yourself in it. Step your game up. Run shields and wrenches in your deck. You don't lose flavor points for doing so. To all the viewers who stayed on until the end, what do you feel about the Battlecruiser mentality? Is that what casual Magic has come to? Are players who run counter Magic and control effects really the scum of the earth? What other tips and strategies do seasoned players have to share with players who are looking to improve their game? Notice that having a ton of money isn't necessary to do so either. If you're a budget player, you can still deal with these kinds of threats while sticking to a budget, even a strict one. Similarly, to any new players, what difficulties have you found when brewing your decks? Is playing Commander overwhelming due to the amount of cards that are legal? Do you find yourself playing in toxic environments and that's what makes you end up hating certain cards? I encourage everyone watching to leave comments down below. That's the purpose of this series. I want to open serious debates and discussions. I want to read people's rebuttals, and I want people to have the opportunity to give their own opinions, post their remarks, and express themselves. Any well thought out comments are welcomed and encouraged. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of Barkeep Upkeep on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and thanks for participating.